Let us continue our discussion. Principle of language acquisition 4 states that L2 language learners can benefit from using those mental resources which they typically utilize when acquiring and using their L1. So there's a connection between their first language and second language. In L1 learning and use learners typically make use of mental imaging. So they do mental imaging. There's something that they visualize. They create pictures in their mind of inner speech, of emotional responses, of connections with their own lives. So they try to relate what they are reading or what they are listening to with their own experiences of evaluations, of predictions, of personal interpretations. In L2 learning and use, learners typically focus narrowly on linguistic decoding and encoding. Multidimensional representation of language experience and use can enrich the learning process in ways which promote durable acquisition and transfer from learning activities to real life use. The development of the ability to use the language effectively in a variety of situations for a variety of uses and the self-esteem which derives from performing in the L2 in ways as complex as they typically do in L1. So to simplify, the connection between L1 and L2. So there is a considerable literature on the vital use of inner voice in L1. So the inner voice in L1 and the infrequency of use of inner voice in the L2. What the literature demonstrates is that in the L1, we use the inner voice to give our own voice to what we hear and read, to make plans, to make decisions, to solve problems, to evaluate, to understand, and to control our environment, and to prepare outer voice utterances before saying or writing them. So there's the inner voice in L1. When talking to ourselves, we use a restricted code which consists of short elliptical utterances expressed in simple tenses with a focus on the comment rather than the topic. So we try to create comments in our minds on the predicate rather than the subject. It is context and context dependent, implicit, partial, vague, novel, and salient to ourselves. However, when we talk about L2 users rarely use an L2 inner voice, rarely use. So we don't talk in English, for example, Filipino learners, we don't talk in English in our minds until they reach an advanced level, unless you are a proficient user of L2, unless you are a proficient user of English, though there is evidence that the use of an L2 inner voice at lower levels can enhance L2 performance. So definitely, when you are when our students are encouraged to make use of L2 of English as they process the information in their mind, so there will be um, better performance and can be facilitated by teachers and materials. For further details of the characteristics and roles of the inner voice, De Guerra, so he and Tomlinson, they provided, and even Avila provided discussions about them. So that's the difference between L1 and L2 as in terms of processing information in our minds. There is also considerable literature on the role of visual imaging in language use and acquisition. It demonstrates is that visual imaging plays. So visual imaging, we should be encouraging our students to create visual image as they learn something. A very important role in L1 learning and use that it tends not to be used by L2 learners and that L2 learners can be trained to use visual imaging to improve their learning and use of the L2 for details. Okay? Now, how do we apply those principles? That particular principle in materials development. Number one, make use of activities which get learners to visualize. The activities should be encouraging students to visualize and or use inner speech before, during, and after experiencing a written or spoken text. Make use of activities which get learners to visualize and or use inner speech before, during, and after, and that's just the same. And number three, make use of activities which help the learners to reflect on their mental activity, reflecting on their mental activity during a task, and then try to make more use of mental strategies in a similar task. Tomlinson builds into all my materials activities which encourage the help the students to visualize, to talk to themselves in inner speech, and to make connections. So he encouraged the students to visualize and to talk to themselves. For example, before asking the students to read a poem about a boy's first day at school, he asked the student to visualize their own first day, to imagine at school, and then to talk to themselves about how they felt. And then later on, the students would be able to express their ideas. Then we have principle of language acquisition number 5. Language learners can benefit from noticing salient features of the input. Noticing the salient features of the input. If learners notice for themselves how a particular language item or feature is used, they are more likely to develop their language awareness, how language is being used, and they are also more likely to achieve readiness for acquisition. Such noticing is most salient when a learner has been engaged in a text effectively and cognitively and then returns to it to investigate its language use. This is likely to lead to the learner paying more attention to similar uses of that item or feature in subsequent inputs and to increase its potential for to analyze. Now, under principles of materials development, number 1, use an experiential approach in which the learners are first of all provided with an experience which engages them holistically. There's this holistic experience. From this experience, they learn implicitly without focusing conscious attention on any particular features of the experience. Later, they revisit and reflect on the experience and pay conscious attention to features of it in order to achieve explicit learning. This enables the learners to apprehend before they comprehend, apprehend first, before they comprehend, there's the emotions first, and into it before they explore. And it means that when they focus narrowly on a specific feature of the text, they are able to develop their discoveries in relation to their awareness of the full context of use. Number 2, rather than drawing the learner's attention to a particular feature of a text and then providing explicit information about its use, it is much powerful to help the learners to make discoveries for themselves. So you should make your students discover things for themselves. Examples. Tomlinson uses a lot of language awareness materials in which the students experience a potentially engaging text again, respond to it personally, and then focus on a particular feature of the text, like for example, the students read about student whose parents gave him a graduation party. Then they discussed the reasons why the parents gave him the party and reasons he was reluctant to attend it. Next, one half of the class analyzed the father's use of the interrogative, and the other half analyzed the son's use of imperative. So there's the language focus, the interrogative. So there's the text, and there's the language feature, the particular feature being discussed and analyzed. Let us move on to the last principle of language acquisition. Learners need opportunities to use language to try to achieve communicative purpose. So, provide opportunities to the learners in communicative purposes. When using language in this way, they are gaining feedback on the hypothesis they have developed as a result of generalizing on the language in their intake and on their ability to make use of them effectively. So they can generate feedback. They can receive feedbacks on how they make use of the language. If they are participating in interaction, they are also being pushed to clarify and elaborate, and they are also likely to elicit meaningful and comprehensible input from their interlocutor. So there's the importance of collaborating. There's the importance of interaction in the class wherein they will be able to practice. They are given the opportunities to express their ideas and make use of the language as well. Number 1, Provide many opportunities for the learners to produce language in order to achieve intended outcomes. Many opportunities like role plays, like discussions, like conversations, and things like that. Number two, make sure that these output activities are designed so that the learners are using language rather than just practicing specified features of it. Okay, that they are actually using the language. They are not so much focused on particular features, like for example in interrogatives, that's a particular feature. They should not be focused on it, but then instead they are trying to make use of the language. Number three, design output activities so that they help learners to develop their ability to communicate fluently, accurately, appropriately, and effectively. The output activities like role plays, as I mentioned a while ago, like discussions, like journals, um, those activities can develop their abilities to communicate fluently. Number four, make sure that the output activities are fully contextualized. Contextualized. That's something that you should remember, that it should be relevant to the students' lives, to the people's lives in the community, in that particular community. Contextualized, localized, in that the learners are responding to an authentic stimulus. It's relevant to their own experiences, that they have specific addresses, and that they have a clear intended outcome in mind. Okay, and number five, try to ensure that opportunities for feedback are built into output activities and are provided for the learners afterwards. That you provide them feedbacks on how they make use of the language. Okay, and make sure that the feedbacks are constructive so that you would be able to build the confidence of the learners. Examples: Tomlinson develops a lot of material in which the students have to produce a text, which is a development from one they have just experienced. For example, in one unit, the students had to tell circle story about part two of a story about strange creatures on a beach, which they had acted out from the teacher's narration of the story. In another unit, they had to relocate a story set in a certain area, and things like that, wherein students would be engaged and they would be able to make use of the language. And that's it. Thank you, guys.